Let me start with something most people don't realize they're doing. Some apologies are not about mistakes, they are about survival. There are people who say sorry even when nothing went wrong. They apologize for asking a question. They apologize for taking space. They apologize for existing a little too loudly in a room. And if this feels familiar, it's probably because at some point in life, apologizing became safer than explaining. This isn't about manners, it isn't about kindness, and it definitely isn't about weakness. It's about psychology. People who apologize too much are often deeply aware of other people's emotions, sometimes painfully so. They notice shifts in tone, pauses in conversation, the smallest change in facial expression. Their mind is constantly scanning the environment, not for danger in the obvious sense, but for emotional disturbance. Somewhere along the way, they learned that peace depends on them. Not real peace, emotional peace. They learned that if something feels tense, it must be their fault. If someone seems uncomfortable, it's their responsibility to fix it. If silence enters the room, they rush to fill it with an apology, even when no accusation was made. This habit doesn't come from confidence issues alone. It usually comes from history. For many people, over-apologizing is born in environments where emotions were unpredictable, where approval felt conditional, where love felt connected to behavior. In those spaces, being good didn't mean being honest. It meant being agreeable. It meant not upsetting anyone. It meant learning how to disappear quietly when needed. Apologizing became a shortcut to safety. When a child grows up feeling like conflict leads to withdrawal, anger, or emotional distance, the brain adapts. It doesn't argue. It doesn't confront. It learns to preemptively surrender. Not because the person is wrong, but because the cost of being right once felt too high. So instead of asking, "Did I do something wrong?" the mind jumps straight to, "I'm sorry." And over time, this response stops feeling like a choice. It becomes automatic. What's interesting is that many people who apologize too much are not careless or irresponsible. In fact, they're often the opposite. They're thoughtful, conscientious. They replay conversations long after they end, wondering if they said something incorrectly, if their tone sounded wrong, if they took up too much time. They carry a quiet sense of emotional responsibility that never really turns off. Psychologically, this connects to something called hyper-responsibility. It's a mindset where a person feels accountable, not just for their actions, but for how everyone else feels as a result of those actions, even when those feelings are not caused by them. So when someone sighs, they apologize. When someone goes quiet, they apologize. When someone misunderstands, they apologize. Not because they caused harm, but because discomfort feels dangerous. There's also a subtle identity layer here. People who apologize excessively often see themselves as the easy one, the adaptable one, the one who doesn't cause problems. That identity can feel comforting, especially if being difficult once led to rejection or criticism. But over time, this identity becomes a cage. Because constantly apologizing sends a message, even if unintentionally. It tells the brain, "My presence is an inconvenience." It reinforces the idea that one's needs are secondary. The taking up space requires permission, and the mind believes what it repeats. There's another important layer that doesn't get talked about enough. Many people who apologize too much are actually very self-aware, but that awareness has turned inward in an unbalanced way. Instead of observing the situation objectively, they turn the spotlight on themselves. What did I do wrong? How did I mess this up? Was I too much? This internal focus can feel like responsibility, but it often hides a deeper fear. The fear of being seen as difficult, selfish, or emotionally unsafe. So apologizing becomes a way to manage how others perceive them. It's a form of emotional regulation, just not a healthy one. The brain starts to associate apology with relief. The tension drops. The conversation moves on. No conflict emerges. For a moment, everything feels stable. But the cost is subtle and cumulative. Over time, people who apologize too much may notice something strange. They feel unseen, even though they're always present. They feel unheard, even though they're always agreeable. They feel resentful, even though they never express anger. Because constantly apologizing doesn't resolve emotions. It compresses them, and compressed emotions don't disappear. They settle quietly, waiting. Another psychological factor here is the fear of escalation. Some people apologize not because they believe they're wrong, but because they're afraid of what happens if things continue. They want to stop the conversation before it turns uncomfortable, before it turns emotional, before it turns unpredictable. So they offer an apology as a peace offering. The mind says, if I apologize now, this won't grow into something bigger. That belief often comes from past experiences where small misunderstandings turned into major emotional events, where disagreements didn't stay contained, where expressing a need led to guilt, blame, or emotional withdrawal. So the nervous system learns to shut things down early. Apologizing becomes a tool to regain control. What's ironic is that this habit often leads to the very thing the person fears. When someone apologizes too often, others may start to feel confused. They may wonder what the person is apologizing for. Some may even start to take the apology as confirmation that something was wrong. And over time, this dynamic can quietly reinforce imbalance in relationships. The person who apologizes carries the emotional weight. The other person carries the authority. Not because either intended it, but because the pattern formed silently. There's also a connection to self-worth here, though it's not always obvious. People who apologize excessively may not consciously think poorly of themselves. They may even be high-achieving, competent, and respected. But deep down, they may struggle to feel entitled to space without justification. They may feel the need to soften their presence, to cushion their words, to preempt rejection. Apologies become emotional padding. Instead of saying, I need help, it becomes, sorry to bother you. Instead of saying, I disagree, it becomes, I might be wrong, but. Instead of saying that hurt, it becomes, sorry, I'm probably overthinking. Each apology slightly reduces the emotional impact of their truth, and eventually their truth starts to feel small, even to themselves. From a psychological perspective, this pattern is often reinforced by positive feedback early on. People may praise them for being polite, easygoing, or understanding. They may be told they're mature for not causing conflict. But maturity isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to navigate it honestly. Avoidance can look like kindness on the surface, but internally it creates tension. There's also an exhaustion that comes with this pattern. Constantly managing emotional environments takes energy. It requires vigilance, it requires restraint. And when someone is always apologizing, they're rarely resting emotionally. Their mind is always adjusting, anticipating, correcting. That's why many people who apologize too much feel tired in social settings. Not physically tired, but mentally drained, because they're performing emotional maintenance in real time. Another important detail is that over-apologizing is not always verbal. Sometimes it shows up in behavior. Over-explaining, justifying decisions unnecessarily, softening opinions until they barely resemble the original thought. All of these are psychological cousins of apologizing too much. They come from the same root, the belief that being misunderstood is dangerous and being disliked is unacceptable. But here's something crucial. Apologizing loses its meaning when it becomes constant. A real apology is powerful because it acknowledges responsibility and repair. But when someone apologizes for things that aren't wrong, the brain stops distinguishing between actual mistakes and normal human presence. Everything starts to feel like a fault. And living in that mental space slowly erodes confidence, not in loud ways, but in quiet, internal ones. People begin to doubt their instincts. They hesitate before speaking. They check themselves before expressing emotion. Not because they don't have something valuable to say, but because they've learned to question their right to say it. This is where the philosophical layer enters. At its core, over-apologizing reflects a question many people never consciously ask. Am I allowed to exist as I am without constantly smoothing myself down? For people who apologize too much, the answer once felt uncertain. So they learn to earn space instead of claiming it. The journey out of this pattern doesn't start with stopping apologies overnight. That usually backfires. The nervous system resists sudden change. It starts with awareness, noticing when an apology is about accountability and when it's about anxiety, noticing when sorry replaces honesty, noticing when discomfort is mistaken for wrongdoing. Because discomfort is part of human interaction. It doesn't always signal danger, and it doesn't always require fixing. Learning this takes time. especially for people whose safety once depended on emotional vigilance. But the shift begins internally. When someone realizes that presence is not a burden, that disagreement is not abandonment, that expressing a need is not selfish. This realization doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives quietly, often in moments of pause, a moment where they almost apologize and then don't. Not out of rebellion, but out of self-respect. And that's where the deeper work begins, because beneath excessive apologies is not fragility, it's adaptation, a strategy that once worked but now asks to be updated. And understanding that is not about judgment, it's about compassion. There comes a moment, usually quiet and almost unnoticeable, when a person who apologizes too much starts to feel something shift. It doesn't happen during a big argument. It doesn't arrive with confidence or clarity. It often shows up as a small pause. A pause where the apology is about to come out, but something inside hesitates. That hesitation is important, because it means the mind is beginning to question an old rule it once lived by. The rule that said emotional safety depends on being agreeable. The rule that said discomfort must be resolved immediately. The rule that said taking up space requires an apology. When someone starts to loosen their grip on that rule, things can feel unsettling at first. Not empowering, not freeing, unsettling. Because for a long time, apologizing worked. It kept relationships stable. It avoided tension. It prevented escalation. It kept the person emotionally safe, or at least safe enough. So when that behavior begins to change, the nervous system doesn't celebrate. It panics. The body may feel tense. The mind may race. There may be an urge to overcorrect, to go back, to smooth things over just in case. This reaction doesn't mean the change is wrong. It means the pattern was deeply ingrained. Psychologically, this is what happens when a safety strategy outlives its usefulness. The brain resists letting it go because it remembers when that strategy mattered. And that's where patience becomes essential. One of the first things people notice when they stop apologizing unnecessarily is how much space opens up internally. Space that was previously filled with self-monitoring, second-guessing, and emotional cleanup. At first, that space can feel uncomfortable. Silence stretches longer than expected. Conversations don't resolve as quickly. Others are allowed to hold their own emotions. This can feel wrong to someone who is used to managing the emotional temperature of every interaction. But slowly, something else begins to happen. They start to realize that not every discomfort needs intervention. The people are capable of processing their own reactions. That disagreement doesn't automatically damage connection. And this realization is deeply regulating, because it returns responsibility to where it belongs. When someone apologizes too much, they often carry emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. They take responsibility for moods, misunderstandings, and reactions that are not fully within their control. Letting go of that responsibility feels like dropping a heavy bag you didn't realize you were carrying. Another shift happens in relationships. Some relationships grow healthier, some become more honest, and some feel strained. This is one of the hardest parts to accept. When someone stops over-apologizing, it changes the balance. People who were used to being emotionally accommodated may feel confused. Some may even feel uncomfortable when the familiar apologies disappear. Not because the person is doing something wrong, but because the dynamic has changed. This doesn't mean the person is becoming cold or uncaring. In fact, many become more present, more genuine, and more emotionally available. But presence without self-erasure can feel unfamiliar to those who benefited from constant accommodation. That's why boundaries often feel lonely at first. Not because they isolate, but because they filter. They reveal which connections were built on mutual respect and which relied on one person constantly shrinking themselves. For people who apologize too much, this realization can be painful, because they often value harmony deeply. They don't want to disappoint others. They don't want to cause distance. But true harmony is not maintained through self-suppression. It's built through honesty, even when honesty feels uncomfortable. There's also a shift in self-perception. When apologies decrease, something else increases. Clarity. People begin to hear their own thoughts more clearly. They become more aware of what they actually feel, not just what feels acceptable to express. They may notice emotions they previously bypassed: mild irritation, quiet frustration, subtle disappointment. These emotions were always there. They were just covered up by politeness and apology, and learning to sit with them without immediately neutralizing them is a skill. Psychology tells us that emotions lose intensity when they are acknowledged rather than avoided. But when someone is used to apologizing as a way to regulate emotion, they may have never learned how to simply feel without fixing. So part of this journey involves emotional tolerance, allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to erase it, allowing silence without filling it with self-blame, allowing someone else's reaction to remain theirs. This doesn't mean becoming insensitive, it means becoming grounded. There's an important distinction here. Healthy accountability doesn't disappear when excessive apologizing stops. Real apologies still matter. Repair still matters. Reflection still matters. What disappears is the automatic self-blame, the reflexive sorry that appears before understanding, the belief that emotional discomfort equals personal failure. This distinction is crucial because many people fear that if they stop apologizing, they will become careless or unkind. In reality, the opposite often happens. When apologies are intentional instead of habitual, they carry more weight. They come from awareness rather than anxiety. They create real connection instead of temporary relief. Another psychological shift occurs around communication. People who stop apologizing unnecessarily often find their words become clearer, shorter, more direct. They stop cushioning every sentence. They stop justifying their existence in conversations. Instead of, "Sorry, this might sound silly, but," they simply speak. And while this can feel exposed at first, it's also deeply empowering because clarity builds trust. Others know where they stand. There's less guessing, less emotional static. This clarity also strengthens self-trust. Each time someone chooses not to apologize when no harm was done, they reinforce a new internal message. My presence does not require permission. That message reshapes identity over time, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. The person begins to see themselves as someone who can hold space without shrinking, someone who can be kind without erasing themselves, someone who can remain connected without self-sacrifice. This is not a loss of softness, it's a refinement of it. True softness includes self-respect. There's also a philosophical truth beneath all of this. Many people who apologize too much are trying to control outcomes, not out of manipulation, but out of fear. They believe that if they say the right thing, act the right way, and smooth every edge, they can prevent rejection, conflict, or abandonment. But human relationships don't work that way. Connection is not something we earn by being perfect. It's something that forms through mutual vulnerability and tolerance for imperfection. When someone stops apologizing excessively, they step into uncertainty. They allow relationships to unfold without constant interference. This is frightening at first, because it removes the illusion of control, but it also allows authenticity to breathe. And authenticity is where real connection lives. Another important change happens internally around self-compassion. People who apologize too much are often very forgiving toward others, but harsh with themselves. They excuse behavior in others while scrutinizing their own. As the apology habit softens, that imbalance begins to correct. They start to offer themselves the same understanding they give freely to others. They realize that making mistakes doesn't make them unworthy, that being misunderstood doesn't make them wrong, that having needs doesn't make them difficult. This realization is not intellectual, it's emotional. It's felt in moments when they choose not to explain themselves, when they let a conversation end without fixing it, when they allow someone else to feel disappointed without rushing to resolve it. These moments build emotional resilience, and resilience is not about toughness, it's about flexibility, the ability to stay grounded when things don't go perfectly. Over time, something else emerges. Confidence, not the loud kind, not the performative kind, but a quiet steadiness, the kind that doesn't rush to justify itself, the kind that can say, "This is how I feel," and remain present even if the response is uncertain. This confidence changes how the world responds. People begin to engage differently. Conversations become more balanced. Respect becomes mutual rather than one-sided. And even when that doesn't happen, the person no longer collapses inward, because their sense of worth is no longer tied to constant approval. This doesn't mean the urge to apologize disappears completely. Old patterns don't vanish, they soften. There will still be moments where sorry rises instinctively, and that's okay. Progress here is not about perfection, it's about awareness. Each time someone notices the impulse and chooses differently, they reinforce a healthier relationship with themselves. They move from emotional survival to emotional presence. And that shift is profound, because the goal was never to stop caring, it was to stop disappearing. People who apologize too much don't need to become someone else. They don't need to harden or withdraw. They simply need permission. Permission to take up space without apology. Permission to feel without fixing. Permission to exist without explanation. And that permission doesn't come from others. It comes from within. Quietly, gently, one moment at a time, not as a declaration, but as a decision to stay.